Picture this for a moment. You love someone deeply, not casually, not halfway, deeply. You care about them. You try to understand them. You stay patient when things feel confusing. You try not to take the distance personally. And yet, somehow the closer you try to get, the further away they seem to move. At first, you tell yourself they just need time, more patience, more understanding. Maybe if you love them gently enough, they'll finally feel safe. But then something painful starts happening. You begin noticing a pattern. Every time closeness grows, something shifts. The warmth cools. The texts slow down. The emotional doors quietly begin to close. And suddenly, you find yourself loving someone who seems to disappear the moment love becomes real. That contradiction hurts because it makes you question everything. Did I ask for too much? Did I become overwhelming? Did I somehow love them the wrong way? But what if the answer is more complicated than that? What if the avoidant person in your life is not pulling away because they don't care, but because caring feels dangerous? Because here is the part most people misunderstand about avoidant people. They are not always afraid of love. They are afraid of what love asks them to feel: dependence, vulnerability, need, emotional exposure, the terrifying possibility that someone could matter enough to hurt them. And if you've never lived inside that nervous system, it can look cold, detached, confusing, sometimes even cruel. But underneath that distance, there is often something much quieter happening. A person trying to protect themselves from the very thing they secretly want: connection. Because imagine this for a second. Imagine spending your whole life learning, sometimes without words. That closeness comes with a cost. That needing people feels unsafe. That depending on someone eventually leads to disappointment. That vulnerability is dangerous. Over time, your nervous system adapts, not because you stop caring, but because caring begins to feel risky. So instead of reaching, you retreat. Instead of softening, you protect. Instead of depending, you convince yourself you do not need anyone. And this is where so many avoidant relationships quietly begin to fracture. Because from the outside, love looks simple. You show up, you care, you reassure, you stay. But to an avoidant nervous system, too much closeness can feel overwhelming. Not because your love is wrong, but because intimacy wakes up fears they spent years learning how to suppress. And this is where so many people accidentally misunderstand the avoidant partner in their life. They think, if they loved me, this wouldn't feel so hard. But love and safety are not always the same thing to an avoidant person. That's the painful truth. Someone can love you deeply and still not know how to stay emotionally close to you, because what they are loyal to often is not distance itself. It is protection. Protection from disappointment. Protection from dependence. Protection from losing themselves. Protection from pain. And when intimacy begins feeling too real, that protection system quietly turns on. Sometimes it looks like withdrawal. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like needing space. Sometimes it looks like emotional confusion they cannot even explain themselves. Because here is what most people never see. The avoidant person is often confused too. Part of them wants closeness. Part of them feels overwhelmed by it. Part of them wants to lean in. Part of them feels the instinct to run. And living inside that contradiction can feel exhausting. Not just for the partner, but for the avoidant person too. Because imagine caring about someone while simultaneously feeling trapped by how important they are becoming. Imagine loving someone while feeling your nervous system quietly panic every time intimacy deepens. That is the push-pull dynamic most people misunderstand. And before we go further, there is something important to say. Understanding an avoidant person is not the same as abandoning yourself for them. You can understand someone deeply and still acknowledge when something hurts. You can hold compassion without carrying the entire relationship alone. Because understanding someone's fear does not mean sacrificing your emotional needs. And that distinction matters a lot because what loving and avoidant actually requires is not chasing, not proving, not becoming smaller. It requires understanding the language of fear underneath the distance. And once you understand that language, their behavior starts making a lot more sense. Because the distance, the withdrawal, the mixed signals, the confusing moments that leave you questioning yourself, most of the time, they are not random. There is a reason beneath them, a nervous system story, and that story usually begins long before you ever arrived. And this is where things start becoming confusing. Because if an avoidant person is pulling away, what exactly are you supposed to do? Love harder? Give more reassurance? Stay more available? Try to prove that you are safe? Most people do. Because when someone you love becomes distant, your instinct is usually to move closer, to explain more, reassure more, reach more. You want to fix what feels broken. You want to close the distance. You want to bring things back to how they felt in the beginning. But here is the painful paradox. With avoidant people, the harder you push for closeness, the more overwhelmed they often become. Not because your love is too much, but because pressure and safety feel like opposites inside an avoidant nervous system. And sometimes, without meaning to, love starts feeling like pressure, even when your intentions are good, even when all you are asking for is reassurance, consistency, presence, basic emotional connection. To you, those things feel reasonable because they are. But to someone whose nervous system learned early that closeness comes with obligation, dependence, or emotional overwhelm, those same requests can quietly trigger fear. And this is where many relationships start entering a painful cycle. You move closer, they move back. You become anxious, they become overwhelmed. You seek reassurance, they seek distance. You ask for clarity, they shut down. And before long, both people are hurting in completely different ways. One person feels abandoned, the other feels pressured. Neither person feels understood. And this is usually the moment people start blaming each other. But underneath the conflict, there is often something much deeper happening. Two nervous systems trying to survive, one reaching for connection, one protecting against vulnerability, and neither fully understanding the other. Because here is something avoidant people rarely know how to explain. Distance is not always rejection. Sometimes, distance is regulation. Sometimes they are not leaving because they stopped caring. Sometimes they are overwhelmed by how much they care. And closeness suddenly feels emotionally loud, too exposing, too vulnerable, too consuming, especially when someone begins depending on them emotionally. Because dependence can wake up something deeply uncomfortable inside an avoidant nervous system. A quiet fear that says, what if I lose myself? What if I disappoint them? What if I fail at this? What if they need more than I can give? What if I become trapped? And most avoidant people will never say these fears out loud. Sometimes because they do not fully understand them themselves. Sometimes because vulnerability feels too dangerous. Sometimes because admitting the fear feels shameful. So instead, they withdraw. They get busy, distracted, over-focused on work, fitness, projects, independence, anything that creates emotional space. And from the outside, it can feel personal, like rejection, like disinterest, like indifference. But often, it is fear wearing the mask of distance. And this is the part most people misunderstand about loving and avoidant. The goal is not to chase harder. because chasing usually activates more fear. But the goal is also not to emotionally disappear. That is where people get confused. Because people here give avoidance space, and suddenly they abandon themselves, silence their needs, accept emotional inconsistency, shrink themselves to avoid conflict, and slowly, without realizing it, they begin disappearing inside the relationship. That is not love. That is survival. And eventually, it becomes resentment. Because no relationship survives when one person is always adapting, while the other never learns emotional responsibility. So, what actually helps? What do avoidant people secretly need, even when they do not know how to ask for it? The first answer is emotional safety, not perfection, not emotional intensity, safety. And safety looks different to an avoidant person than it does to most people. Safety means low pressure, predictability, consistency, calm communication, emotional steadiness, not emotional volatility. Because many avoidant people grew up learning that relationships felt emotionally unpredictable. Love came with criticism, pressure, control, enmeshment, disappointment, or emotional inconsistency. So now, their nervous system constantly scans for signs that closeness might cost them something: freedom, autonomy, peace, identity. And if love begins feeling emotionally chaotic, the instinct to withdraw becomes stronger. This is why calmness matters. Not perfection, calmness. Not, why are you doing this to me? But, I want to understand what's happening. Not emotional explosions, but emotional steadiness. Not mind reading, but clarity. Because avoidant people often struggle with ambiguity. They may act emotionally detached, but internally, many are constantly assessing risk, trying to figure out what is expected, trying not to fail, trying not to disappoint, trying not to feel trapped. Which brings us to something surprising. Many avoidant people secretly respond better to clarity than emotional intensity. Meaning, instead of, you never care about me, something calmer often lands better. I feel disconnected lately. I miss feeling close to you. Instead of blame, specificity. Instead of emotional flooding, clarity. Because clarity feels safer than emotional unpredictability. And here is another thing avoidant people quietly need, even if they rarely admit it. They need someone who respects their nervous system without enabling their avoidance. That balance matters. Because healthy love is not, take all the space you need while I quietly suffer. And it is not, open up right now or this relationship is over. It lives somewhere in the middle. Compassion with boundaries, patience with honesty, understanding without self-abandonment. Maybe pause here for a second, because if you have loved an avoidant, I wonder how many nights you spent blaming yourself for someone else's fear. How many times you called yourself needy for wanting consistency. How many times you convinced yourself that asking for reassurance meant asking for too much. And if that sounds familiar, I hope you hear this clearly. Your needs are not the problem. Understanding avoidance does not mean abandoning yourself. Both things can be true. You can understand why someone struggles with closeness and still acknowledge that the relationship hurts you. You can love someone deeply and still need more than they can give. That tension is real, and it deserves honesty, because eventually, every relationship reaches the same quiet question: can love survive if only one person keeps stretching? And this is where things become painful, because loving an avoidant for too long, without boundaries, can slowly make you lose yourself. And that is the part almost nobody talks about, because slowly, almost invisibly, something begins changing inside the person who keeps trying. At first, you do not notice it. You just tell yourself to be patient. You tell yourself, they're overwhelmed. They just need time. They care. They're just scared. And maybe that is true. Maybe they are scared. Maybe closeness really does feel overwhelming to them. But there is a cost to constantly understanding someone, while quietly abandoning yourself. And the cost usually arrives slowly, not all at once. Because loving an avoidant person can sometimes feel like standing outside a locked house, holding flowers, hoping that eventually they will let you in. Some days the door opens. You see warmth, softness, connection. You think, finally, we're getting somewhere. And for a moment, everything feels hopeful again. They open up. They seem emotionally present. They tell you things they do not tell anyone else. You feel chosen, safe, close. And then, without warning, the distance returns. The silence, the emotional absence, the sudden shift you cannot quite explain. And because humans are meaning-making creatures, your brain starts searching for answers. What changed? Did I say something wrong? Did I become too emotional? Too available? Too needy? So naturally, you begin adjusting yourself. You text less, ask for less, need less, feel less. You try to become easier to love, less overwhelming, less demanding, less emotional, less human. And this is where something dangerous quietly begins. Because when someone else's fear becomes the center of the relationship, your own emotional reality slowly starts disappearing. You stop asking for reassurance. You stop bringing things up. You stop saying when something hurts. Not because it stopped hurting, but because you are afraid honesty will push them further away. And eventually, you become hyper-aware. You notice every pause, every delayed text, every change in energy, every moment they seem emotionally distant. Your nervous system becomes focused on reading them, trying to predict them, trying to avoid triggering distance again. And without realizing it, the relationship slowly becomes emotionally unequal. One person protecting themselves from closeness, the other person working overtime to preserve connection. And here is the painful irony. The more emotionally hungry the relationship becomes, the more pressure the avoidant often feels, which creates more distance. And that distance creates more anxiety, which creates more reaching, which creates more overwhelm. And suddenly, both people are stuck inside a cycle neither of them wanted. Because underneath avoidance, there is usually fear, but underneath anxious chasing, there is fear too. Fear of abandonment, fear of being unwanted, fear of losing someone you love. Two people hurting in opposite directions, one reaching, one retreating, both secretly asking the same question. Am I safe here? And this is where so many people misunderstand themselves, especially the partner loving the avoidant. Because somewhere along the way, you may have started confusing survival with love. You thought, if I just become more understanding, if I just stop asking for so much, if I just learn how to love them better, maybe then they'll stay. But love was never supposed to require disappearing. And this matters deeply, because there is a difference between loving someone compassionately and carrying a relationship alone. There is a difference between patience and emotional starvation. There is a difference between understanding trauma and becoming trapped inside its consequences. And if nobody has said this to you before, understanding someone's wounds does not obligate you to bleed forever. That matters, especially here, because many avoidant relationships survive on potential, not reality. You fall in love with who they are during the moments of closeness, the tenderness, the vulnerability, the softness they only show sometimes. And you hold on to those moments like proof. See, they care. See, they're trying. See, this could work. And sometimes it can work, but only if both people are willing to see the pattern honestly. Because love alone does not heal avoidance. Awareness helps. Therapy helps. Emotional accountability helps. Learning how to tolerate closeness helps. But love by itself, love is not always enough. And that truth hurts, especially if you have spent years trying. Especially if you built your identity around being patient, understanding, loyal, the one who stayed. Maybe pause here for a second, because if this feels painfully familiar, I wonder how many times you convinced yourself that wanting consistency meant you were asking for too much. How many nights you replayed conversations, trying to figure out how to be easier to love. How many times you swallowed your needs, because keeping the peace felt safer than honesty. And if that is where you are right now, there is something important to understand. Wanting emotional safety does not make you needy. Wanting consistency does not make you demanding. Wanting to feel emotionally chosen does not make you too much. Those are deeply human needs. And sometimes the hardest truth to face is not whether someone loves you, but whether they are capable of loving you in the way that allows both people to feel safe. Because those are not always the same thing. Someone can love you deeply and still not have the emotional capacity to sustain closeness. Someone can care and still keep hurting you. Someone can mean well and still leave you feeling lonely. That contradiction is real, and it breaks a lot of hearts. But this is also the place where clarity begins, because eventually, the question quietly changes. It stops becoming, how do I finally get them to stay close? And slowly becomes, what would it look like to stop abandoning myself in the process of loving them? And strangely enough, that question is often where healing begins, not just for the person loving the avoidant, but sometimes for the avoidant person too. And maybe this is where we need to talk about the question underneath all of this. Because after enough distance, enough confusion, enough nights lying awake trying to understand someone who keeps pulling away, most people quietly start asking themselves, can this actually get better? Can an avoidant person really heal? Can love ever stop feeling like something they have to run from? And the answer is yes, but probably not in the way most people hope. Because healing avoidance is not about suddenly becoming emotional overnight. It is not about magically becoming vulnerable. It is not about waking up one morning and deciding, okay, I'm healed now. Healing is slower than that, quieter than that, sometimes painfully ordinary. Because what an avoidant person is really healing is not distance. It is fear. Fear of depending on someone. Fear of needing someone. Fear of losing themselves inside closeness. Fear that love eventually becomes obligation. Pressure. Control. Pain. And fears that deep do not disappear because someone loved them enough. They soften when someone becomes willing to face them. That part matters. Because one of the biggest misunderstandings about avoidant attachment is this. People think love heals avoidance. It can help, but love alone rarely changes deeply wired protection patterns. Awareness changes things. Responsibility changes things. Learning emotional safety changes things. Therapy changes things. Self-reflection changes things. And perhaps hardest of all, learning how to stay present when closeness feels uncomfortable. Because for many avoidant people, distance feels safer than intimacy. Silence feels safer than vulnerability. Independence feels safer than depending. And healing often means learning how to tolerate closeness without seeing it as danger. Learning how to stay instead of automatically leaving emotionally. Learning how to say, I feel overwhelmed right now, instead of disappearing. Learning how to communicate fear instead of protecting it behind withdrawal. And if you are the avoidant person listening to this, I want to say something gently. Your need for space does not make you bad. Your fear does not make you cold. Your overwhelm does not make you incapable of love. But healing asks something difficult of you. It asks you to stop calling self-protection the same thing as peace. Because sometimes, what feels safe is actually loneliness wearing familiar clothes. Sometimes the walls protecting you are also the walls keeping love out. And that truth is painful because many avoidant people do care deeply, sometimes more deeply than anyone realizes. But caring silently is not always the same thing as creating safety with someone. Love cannot survive only inside your head. Eventually, it has to become visible, consistent, safe enough to trust. And if you are loving an avoidant person right now, this part matters for you too. Because healing cannot become your full-time job. You cannot carry emotional intimacy for two people forever. You cannot keep translating silence, excusing distance, shrinking your needs, calling loneliness patience. At some point, love has to become mutual effort, not perfect effort, not flawless effort, but real effort. Because relationships survive through repair, through honesty, through accountability, through two nervous systems slowly learning safety together. Not one person endlessly waiting, while the other keeps leaving emotionally. And this is where the conversation becomes uncomfortable, because sometimes the relationship heals. The avoidant person becomes self-aware. They start learning. They start communicating. They stop disappearing every time closeness feels scary. They begin building something secure. Slowly, messily, imperfectly, but genuinely. And sometimes, that does not happen. Sometimes the person you love is not ready. Sometimes they stay loyal to distance, to emotional self-protection, to the version of themselves that believes needing people is weakness. And if that happens, you have to ask yourself a very hard question. Not, do I love them enough? You already know you do. But, can I keep loving someone without losing myself? Because love should stretch you, but it should not erase you. Love should challenge you, but it should not emotionally starve you. Love should feel safe enough to exhale inside. And if you have spent years begging for crumbs of closeness, calling inconsistency chemistry, calling confusion connection, I hope something in you remembers this. You are not difficult to love. You are not needy for wanting consistency. You are not asking for too much because you want reassurance. You are asking for relationship. And relationship requires participation from both people. Maybe pause here for a second. Because if this video brought something painful to the surface, I hope you also hear this. Healing does not begin when somebody finally chooses you. Healing begins when you stop abandoning yourself, when you stop negotiating with loneliness, when you stop calling emotional absence potential, when you stop proving your worth to people who only love safely from a distance. And strangely, that is often the moment everything changes. Because when you stop chasing, clarity arrives. Sometimes the avoidant person finally turns inward and begins healing. And sometimes, you finally walk toward the kind of love that no longer feels confusing. Either way, you stop losing yourself. And maybe that is where real healing begins. If this resonated with you, tell me honestly in the comments. What has been the hardest part of loving an avoidant person or being one? I read them. And sometimes, hearing your story reminds someone else that they are not alone. And if this gave language to something you have been carrying quietly for a long time, subscribe to the Inner Odyssey. Because here, we talk about the psychology underneath the pain, the patterns beneath relationships, and the parts of healing most people never explain. Until next time, protect your peace, but do not abandon your heart.